Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back redoing another one of my bigger rankings from 5 years ago, where here I'll be redoing my season ranking for Big Brother US. Where here I'll be ranking all 25 seasons of the mainline show, based on obviously my personal enjoyment of these seasons. I believe the last time I did this was before BB21. Now technically I did do a mixed ranking of BB Can, I believe after BB21 though. And obviously there are going to be 5 new seasons since the last time I've actually done this video, along with the fact that there are a lot of placement changes, as I feel like my season ranking in particular is one that there's so much really in flux with these, as it really just comes down to how I'm feeling about a season at any particular day, which could very much change. And we will be ranking all 25 seasons of the show. So let's start off at number 25. The worst season of Big Brother is unsurprisingly Big Brother 1, where again, there's a reason why the Big Brother 1 format did not continue beyond this, as again, BB1 is just simply boring. It's long, it's dragged out, and there's literally 70 episodes, and there's just nothing really happening. Now, straight up, I've not watched Big Brother 1 in literally over a decade. I've only watched it once, and it was around the time of BB14. So obviously, this is a bit of an antiquated take, though again, I just remember being miserable watching this season, to where again, I'll probably end up rewatching the season at some point and making a video on it, to where maybe my opinion changes. I very much doubt that. It just seems like a very miserable season. It's just, again, very little drama happening. I mean, probably the biggest storyline is Chicken George trying to lead a revolt against production, or Will Mega being this controversial figure at the time, and like outside that, there's really not much really going on this season for me. So again, I do have it at the bottom here at 25. 24, the worst actual season of Big Brother, ends up being a very recent one, a new addition to the list. We got BB22, and BB22 is just a miserable season. Again, it's one where obviously it was mid-COVID, and yeah, it was cool to have this all-star season, though obviously it just turns out in the worst possible way. Obviously we get this majority alliance forming very early on that just runs the table comp-wise, and there's really almost no intrigue in this season. I mean, while there are minor points like Devon winning the veto that almost led to the majority alliance turning on each other, or Kaser winning the safety suite in week 1, it's like outside that, like this season is very dry, with again Cody just running the game from beginning to end. And while we do get this great moment in the finale of him cutting Nicole, it still is just a very predictable season through and through, to where mixing that with the fact that again there was this overtly negative tone to it, where no one really seemed to be having fun. You have the entire Tyler situation, along with Christmas's fights with Bailey and Devon, that really just sapped a lot of the fun out of the season as well. So again, it simply is just not a fun season with very stagnant gameplay, and that's why it's here at number 24. Now number 23, moving on this season, I know people are going to be upset that I have this season this low, but at 23, I do have Big Brother 2. Which, again, I personally always not really love this season. I feel like it's a season that's super slow, with very little of intrigue going on. I do think the lack of the veto definitely does play a factor into that, to where you have the middle episode of the week with just, again, nothing really going on there. Now, obviously, it is a massive improvement upon BB1, where just in general, the casting is a lot more notable. You obviously have Dr. Will, one of the all-time great characters, but you still have this interesting arc for Nicole. You have Hardy. You have Monaco's interesting character. Bunky is an interesting character. You have Shannon. You have Shannon Boogie as very notable early boots. You obviously get to see a lot of foundational strategy on the season, but really, the season for me as a whole, though, is just very slow. And again, it's not just that this is an old-school season. That's the reason why. As again, I have Big Brother 3, a season that was right after it, so much higher on the list. So for me, again, this season just does not click with me as much as it seems like it does with most other people. So while it's not entirely bad, it's also just a very prolonged season. And because that for me, it's here at number 23. Number 22, we're moving back to modern seasons. This being a season that has significantly sunk in my estimations over time, to where I just simply do not find this season that interesting, and that is Big Brother 16. And to be fair, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that I think Big Brother 16 is kind of a season that I blame for the modern trajectory of Big Brother. This being a season that's kind of an overtly positive season with very little drama, mixing that in the fact that, again, we get a lot of stagnant gameplay from Derek really breaking the game and essentially just showing how to optimally structure your alliance. And again, just Derek just dominates the season from beginning to end in a really stale way. So while there are some good characters on this season for sure, I mean, Zach Rance is still an all-time great character. Donnie is super likable. Even the rise and fall of Frankie across this season is a really interesting arc for him. There's still also a good chunk of duds on this cast, to where a lot of the earlier boots don't bring much to the table outside of obviously Devin, who is incredible TV. But really, I mean, I think that's the thing with this season. It starts off very well. I mean, you do have weeks 1 and 2 where Devin's going on a rampage. But after he gets taken out, it's essentially just this domination from Derek with a minor spike in week 5, which is a strong week. But beyond that, again, you also have Battle the Block, which also slows things down. Along with the fact that we get Rewind week, and it's like this season's just too long. Where I just personally have very little enjoyment from this season, so that's why it's here number 22. Now 21, moving on this season that, again, this might not be super popular considering it does seem like the general consensus around the season is that it's pretty good. However, I personally found it boring as well, and that is Big Brother 23. And BB23 is a season that is obviously very historically significant. And I won't take away credit from the Cookout, who obviously did what they needed to do in terms of representing their community. However, it does not make for good TV. Like, again, I just found the season really boring to see people not even trying to even play the game because they obviously had a greater purpose. And we see people that were actually playing good games, and the likes of Kylan and Tiffany just sink their games for the sake of going to the end with the Cookout. And what makes it even more frustrating is that we see the two most benefited from the fact that Cookout even exists, and Xavier and Big D get to the end with Xavier winning, despite the fact that he knows very little about what actually happened on the season. And again, that ends up being super frustrating as a result here. Strip, I do think I probably would have looked at the season a bit more positively had Tiffany ended up going on to win this season. Again, for us to get the endgame that we got, which is super frustrating. And beyond that, again, like, just a lot of the game just felt very stagnant due to the fact that the Cookout were loyal to each other, which no one else obviously knew existed. Where we do see some intrigue from, like, Tiffany having to put up Claire, but it was also an increasingly frustrating situation in itself, considering how bad it was for her game. Now, obviously, again, like BB16, the beginning of the season is great. The entire Frenchie of it all is fantastic TV. You also have week 5 where Christian gets backdoored. That's a pretty strong week as well. And again, this is a fun cast. I do think the majority of this cast are pretty entertaining, but I do think it is the lack of people playing the game for themselves that does lead to this not being a super interesting season to me, even though, again, I get the historical significance around it. So because of those reasons, for me, I have this at 21. Now, number 20, we're moving on to a season that has gone up in my estimations in recent times. As literally in my last season ranking, this was the bottom ranked season of them all. However, it's now not at the bottom. At least there's that, and that is BB4. And I mean, BB4 is a season that I still do have complaints with it. I do still feel like it's a season that has a bit of a negative tone to it. I do feel like a lot of people are simply just being mean-spirited for the sake of it. That comes off as more icky than fun, along with the fact that a lot of this cast is just not super likable, and really even beyond that, not even that entertaining. Well, obviously June and Allison are a really fantastic final two, really great characters as well, but I mean, beyond that, it's, again, you got the likes of like Robert, you got Erica, you got Justin, who are all super dull, with each of them, again, having very icky moments across their runs. You have G, who also isn't even that interesting of a character, though at least does play the game in an interesting way. Jack is fun. Dana is fun TV. Nathan has moments, but again, like, it's kind of a middling cast to me, to where mixing out of the fact that we get the X Factor, which obviously takes up so much of the focus in the edit, which, again, is an interesting concept, especially in terms of how it relates to the game, though I think when we're simply getting this content about their relationships, it's simply just not that interesting. Really, just overall, I feel like the main pros for the season are, again, the Allison and June of it all, both in the fact that they're fantastic characters, but also their run on the season ends up being super notable, where outside of that, it's just not a fun season due to how much ickiness there is, but there's at least that intrigue that leads to here, number 20. Or number 19, we're moving on to a season that I know a lot of people have as like the worst season of all time. However, I personally get some enjoyment out of this season. That season is season 19, where, again, BB19 is talked about as a season where, okay, Paul dominates, it's super boring, the cast is full of idiots, and like that aspect of it, again, I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but I think there are moments in this season that are fantastic TV. Like, to me, BB19 feels like this type of season that is kind of good at the things that most other seasons are bad at. Where, I mean, it does start off well, like some of these other seasons we've talked about so far, where the first week is really, really great, where Cody just blows up his own game and trying to target Paul, and then puts Christmas on the block, and has none of them end up going home. But like beyond that, one of the bigger pros for this season to me is the results, is the finale in particular. I think the finale episode is one of the best episodes in Big Brother history, where we do get this Josh Paul final two, where Josh surprisingly beats Paul at the end, which was fantastic TV there, along the fact that we get this great jury questioning where Paul starts to realize that he's going to lose again, and we have him facing that trauma, which, again, just overall the arc of Paul across the season is incredible. Having them run the game only for them to lose in pretty much the exact same way. And that's also what leads to me finding the final 8 on of this season also really great TV. To where, while yes, there is definitely this massive slow point in the middle, where after the Ramses vote until Mark goes out, it's a pretty slow stretch of the season, where yes, it's just Jessica going out, and we do get the Holting Hex, which also harms things as well. But then it's Cody, and then Mark and Elena, and it's like, yeah, that is dull. But the final 8 on is actually pretty strong, where again, we have Paul really just manipulating everything. And to me, I just find it really interesting to see Paul fully explain how they're running the game, especially when it's in this misguided way, this way that has them completely forgoing jury management, not realizing how to manage the jury, which ends up costing them the game. But we still have like Christmas winning the running comp, which is still an all-time great moment for me. We have the Jason blindside, which was a pretty great moment. We had Josh's goodbye messages, which were fun. We also had incredible jury segments, which again is very rare nowadays. But I felt like the jury segments on the season were some of the best of all time, with the jury roundtable in particular being incredible. And again, like to me, like I feel like the season kind of excels at things that a lot of other seasons don't excel at. Now, again, it still is flawed. Again, the cast still is not the greatest in the world. You still have this middle stretch that is extremely slow, but again, it has a great finale, great jury segments, and an actual somewhat interesting steamroll towards the end, to where, for me, again, I personally like BB19 more than most people, and that's why it's here number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a season that I've always been a bit conflicted on. I mean, this is a season that obviously had a lot of controversy surrounding it, and while the endgame stretch of the season definitely is a lot more fun, where there's a lot more dynamic gameplay, I've always struggled with where exactly I wanted to land it. By 18, I'm going with BB21. And BB21, again, was a season that I did not particularly like at the time of it airing. I did not find this to be an entertaining season. I just found the season to be, again, just filled with like a lot of ickiness, to where, despite the endgame's dynamics being a lot more interesting, I think still the result of Jackson winning at the end, despite the fact that, again, I do think Jackson played one of the better games this season, it's still a pretty unsatisfying conclusion to the season, considering all the controversies around him. And along with that, again, the beginning of the season is rough. It's extremely tough to watch. Essentially just everything leading up to Camp Comeback, where, again, there's a lot of ickiness, there's a lot of terrible behavior from the people in charge, and then while we get some intrigue with the Cliff HOH, he ends up folding by the end of the week anyway, which, to be fair, I think is the right call game-wise, but again, was still not the greatest TV. But again, everything ends up shaking up when the 6 years blows up, which, again, that's an all-time great moment, along with Jessica's HOH, where she puts up Jack and Jackson, which, again, is still not the greatest move in the world, but still fun TV. And then following that, again, you get like Taco Tuesday, you get the final 5 round, which is still an incredible sequence of events there. Again, there is stuff to like on this season, but again, like for it to conclude with Jackson just winning out and winning despite how unlikable of a presence he is, again, I do think that is something that sours the season a bit, along the fact that, again, it just is filled with this ickiness to begin with, to where, again, it's just a bit of a rough season for me to assess. So because that, for me, it's here number 18. Now number 17, we're moving on to a similar season, though it's one that I do have a bit more connection to, along the fact that I do find the result of the season a lot more palatable, and that season is Big Brother 15. And obviously Big Brother 15 will always be known as the racist season, the season that had Aaron and Gina Marie, and even beyond that had numerous people on the cast just making terrible comments, from the likes of Amanda and Spencer and Caitlin, Jeremy, David. Again, there was just so much negativity surrounding this season. However, again, it's a similarly structured season to BB21, where, again, we do get a very fluid endgame with Andy making these big moves, again, taking out Helen, then flipping and taking out Amanda, bringing the exterminators. Again, we get the Alyssa double eviction, which is incredible. And we do also start the season off very well here with the first 2 weeks where David and Nick end up going home. Again, the rise and fall of the moving company was fantastic. But obviously, like, yeah, the racism of it all definitely does sink this season, to where it does make it a bit tough to really assess. Now, I think at the end of the day, my opinions of it are very similar to BB21, to where, again, I think it's a season with a lot of interesting gameplay, but is obviously harmed by the terrible behavior from the people on the season. Though I think something that has elevated a bit for me is that BB15, again, despite its flaws, is still a season that I do have a level of nostalgia for. I mean, it is the first season where I fully watched the live feeds for, that I really got into the online community, to where, again, there is that level of nostalgia from those aspects of the show, but again, just as a whole, overall, it's still a season that has a very negative tint to it. So because of that, for me, it's here number 17. Number 16, we have a season that is a lot more recent, though in a way has a similar vibe to it. And at number 16, I do have BB24. And BB24 is a season that I do think as a whole is really propelled by the fact that Taylor wins. I do think if Taylor had not won this season, I would probably have it lower. Where outside that, again, it is a bit of a negative feeling season. Again, early on, you do have obviously the treatment of Taylor and how negative that was. And while again, I think we get this great storyline from the leftover formation, which is still an all-time great week of Big Brother, week 3 of this season, to where beyond that, we get this great downfall for the main conspirators against Taylor and Amira, then Nicole, and then Daniel, which is all really satisfying to see. Then we have the entire Kyle situation, which in itself is also very icky and does definitely sap a lot of the fun from the season as well. Where, while I think Kyle was an interesting player in the fact that he was kind of running the game, but doing so in a very flawed way, and in a way that did lead to a lot of drama between him and his alliance, it still was again overshadowed by the fact that he essentially tried to form an all-white person alliance. And beyond that, again, we still have the mistreatment of Taylor towards the end of the game with Terrence and Monty continuing to make comments about her. And again, there definitely is a level of negativity surrounding this season, but there's still also some interesting gameplay on this season. Again, the leftover formation, fantastic. The run of Michael across this season was really interesting, and see him eventually get taken out was really great too. Even the end game itself, again, the final 5 round is surprisingly decent. Obviously, we have Monty's entire run in the end game of him making the incorrect decision at the end and cutting Turner, and either going to end with Taylor and ends up losing to her. And that's all really interesting. And Taylor's overall winning storyline is just incredible. But to me, there's still this like negative tinge this season that does harm it a bit. But it is still one of the better recent seasons of the show, which is kind of sad that it only leaves it here at number 16. Number 15, who would have guessed? We're going to another recent season of the show, the most recent season of the show. We do have BB25. And BB25 is a season that for me is a season of 2 halves. The first half of the season is incredible. Probably one of the best first half of the seasons we've ever had. I mean, the first 6 weeks of the season were just riveting feeds, where Izzy Boot Week in particular is an all-time great week of Big Brother. But then we get the back half, and the back half is a lot rougher. To where while we do get a couple good weeks from like the Mimi Boot Week, the Corey Boot Week's okay, it really just is this steamroll from Jag and him winning comp after comp after comp that was just not interesting to watch. So obviously there is this massive dichotomy with this season. I think this season probably has higher highs than a lot of the seasons that we're going to be talking about in this next batch, but it also has lower lows. Again, also the fact that the season was 100 days and was super prolonged is also a massive negative to it as well. And it's just a bit of a tough season to assess because, again, I do think watching Cirie run the game early on was just such great TV. She still does end up having a pretty interesting arc by the end of it. Again, I very much like Corey and America on this season. I thought we had incredible characters from the likes of Felicia and Izzy, and even Heisem as an early boot. Again, this does end up being a pretty strong cast, and I do feel like the gameplay of the season, the first half in particular, was really fun TV, though it just, again, gets halted in the back half. For me, again, it was very tough to find its placement on this list, where initially I did have it at around 12, though I do think after further assessment, I do feel like at the end of the day, my opinions of it are pretty similar to that of BB24. So I just have it a step above it here at number 15. Now, number 14, we're moving on to kind of a clump of seasons of a bit earlier on seasons. I do think definitely have issues to them, though are still pretty fun rides. And at 14, we're starting all that off with Big Brother 12. And BB12 is essentially, to me, BB16 done right. It is a season that, while it could have been very boring, as it is the steamroll of the Brigade just running the show from beginning to end with almost no intrigue gameplay-wise throughout the entirety of the season, it is still a season that is still fun despite that. I mean, it's a season that has these all-time great characters on it, from the likes of Brittany and Rachel. You have like Enzo and Matt Hoffman. You have some funnier, understated characters from like Kathy, and you have Lane, who's probably a very underrated confessionalist in the grand scheme of things. And to me, this is just a pretty strong cast of the show, to where, to me, this is essentially the epitome of the talk about how you always have a good season as long as you have a good cast. As again, like everything outside the cast on this season is not particularly good. Again, the gameplay of the season is extremely stagnant, with almost nothing interesting happening throughout the entirety of it. I mean, really just the Matt blindside is the only point in the season where like something interesting happens. Outside of that, it's really just targeting of Brennan and Rachel and them winning comps to keep themselves safe at points, but it does lead to, again, a lot of stagnation through it, which again is propelled by good gameplay, but it's not the most riveting TV. And again, that leads to this dichotomy with the season and how separate the episodes were from how the live feeds were, where I know from a live feed perspective, this is one of the worst seasons of the show ever, where it's just extremely boring. But again, for me, this is also a pretty nostalgic season. I mean, this is around the time that I got back into Big Brother, and while the other seasons surrounding this season are much higher on the list because of that nostalgia for it, I do feel like this is still a season that is propelled due to that nostalgia along with its great characters, so that's why it's here number 14. Now number 13, and straight up from this point on, I do feel like these are all pretty great seasons of the show. I think these are all seasons that I personally do very much enjoy, and at 13, we're going as old school as we possibly can at this point. We're going to Big Brother 3, where, as I mentioned before, Big Brother 2, I do feel like Big Brother 3 was a massive improvement upon Big Brother 2, where despite it having the old school structuring and editing that, again, I found slow in Big Brother 2, I feel like the Big Brother 3 cast in particular is very strong, with not really even a single true dud on it, with I think everyone bringing at least something to the table, and us having, again, these old-time great characters. Again, Danielle Reyes is on this season, seeing her have these really cutting confessionals, along with her playing the game in a really impressive way is something that's cool to see on this season, along with her relationship with Jason, who also is an interesting character. Marcellus is an all-time great character on this season. Roddy is a really interesting character. Amy had some fun moments. Josh, again, despite him not aging particularly well, also is interesting TV at points. Even Jerry brought some interesting moments. Like, and this cast on this season is really incredible. Again, another one of these that has the casting really improving the season, but beyond that, again, like, just the level of gameplay was a step above BB2, where we do get most of this cast playing hard, and while, again, not playing well for a lot of it, again, at least they are playing very aggressively. And again, we get these great votes early on, which are all very close votes. We have like the Tanya blindside, the Eric blindside. Marcellus's blindside at the end is obviously an all-time great moment. Now, obviously, it's a bit underwhelming that Lisa ends up winning the season, but still, as a whole, I do feel like this is a pretty great old-school season of the show, to where I did actually even consider putting it even higher on the list, though I just personally connect to a lot of other seasons more than BB3, which is enough to land it here at number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to a season that most people would have so much lower on their respective season rankings. However, I've always loved this season, despite its flaws, and that season is Big Brother 9. And BB9 is this interesting season. Obviously, it's kind of this forgotten season in Big Brother history, the season that people don't like to talk about, because it is this like weird season that starts off with this duos twist that is like really dumb game wise, and it has a lot of unlikable figures on its cast with some pretty icky moments here and there, and it's obviously won by a person who later gets arrested for using his prize winnings to start a drug ring, and all that is really bad. But I still personally love this season. And sure, this is one of my most rewatched seasons of the show. I mean, I did not watch this season live. It's actually one of the few that I did not watch live since I started watching at BB5, though despite that, it's a season that I used to actually just rewatch over and over and over again, as, again, I've always personally loved this season. I mean, again, yeah, the casting is not the greatest here. There's a lot of unlikable figures, but there's still some pretty great TV characters. I mean, I think Adam is probably one of the better TV character winners in the history of the show. Well, I mean, while he does have an icky moment earlier on, he does proceed to get some pretty fun character moments throughout. You also have the arc of Crazy James, which I've always found interesting. You have Natalie, who's a really fun character. Sheila's a fun character. Maddie, made for really great TV. Chelsea was a fantastic character. Joshua, despite how, again, icky some of the things he says is, I do think still made for some pretty great TV. Even earlier on, I mean, Jen and Parker were incredible TV. Amanda was fantastic TV. Jacob is still an all-time bad player, and it's really fun to see him blow up his game. Again, there's a lot of fun to be had on this season. I still think the Maddie boot week is one of my favorite weeks in all of Big Brother. And I still think there's an all-time great 2-week stretch on this season where Ryan blindsides James, only for James to come back and then blindside Maddie the following week. Like, that's an incredible 2-week stretch of the show. So yes, I can understand why people don't like this season. I've always personally had a lot of attachment to the season and always found it to be a fun ride. So that's why for me it's here at number 12. Now, number 11, we're moving back to more recent seasons of the show. These more recent seasons that I think are looked at as the better recent seasons. However, we're starting it off with the season that is probably looked at as the most popular of the recent seasons, even though I've never gelled with it as much as others, but I still do like it. At number 11, I do have BB17. And again, BB17 is a season that I think has now grown to be one of the consensus, like, better seasons of the show. I think a lot of people would have this in their top 5. However, I don't know, something never really clicked with me of this season. I do feel like, while it is a fun ride for sure, again, Vanessa running the game is still really interesting to see. Steve cutting her at the very end is still a really interesting moment there. You do have the Austin blindside as his all-time great moment. You have Vanessa getting backdoored, only to stay despite that. You have Dave Vaughn early on. You have Audrey, who's incredible. The Jason blindside's a really great week. Again, there definitely is a lot to praise with this season. But, I don't know, for me, it just never really clicked. I mean, I didn't particularly love it at the time. So for a while, again, we do get some great characters from the likes of Johnny Mac and Vanessa and I guess James. I don't know, the cast has never really clicked with me to where I do think there's a decent amount of duds on this season to where, again, Jeff is there. I also feel like, again, as much as people do seem to like Jackie, I don't feel like she really brought much to the table for me. Becky was also not the most riveting TV, even though game-wise, I think she did some interesting things. Meg is just kind of there. Clay is a person. Even Steve, even though I'll continue to defend his game, I don't think is the most riveting TV. So again, to me, from a pure entertainment standpoint, I don't find this cast to be that great. But I do think it is a season that, again, does have some big moments. I think Vanessa's overall run this season is an all-time great one. It's definitely a season I do like in the grand scheme of things, though I've always found the middle stretch of the season to be kind of slow, the point where from after the Vanessa backdoor until pretty much the final 6, that is a particularly slow batch of the season in my mind, but still it's a season I do like as a whole, despite its issues. To where for me, I still have it here, number 11. Now, number 10, moving on to another more recent season, to where this one I actually have the opposite interpretation of BB17. To where with BB17, it's a season that I don't like as much as most people. Well, this one, I feel like it's a season that I like more than most people, and I'm kind of surprised that even being the case, but that season is BB18. And again, I never really understood why people didn't like BB18, because even at the time, people hated BB18, and I just never really got it. To me, this was a very interesting season. It's a season with probably one of the most dynamic houses in the history of the show, where once Paulie goes, it's really this season of pairs maneuvering through the game. Ends up being really interesting to see, with Nicole and Corey pretty much ending up outplaying the other pairings to get towards the end. But beyond that, again, we get Paul, who's an incredible character on this season. We have Dave Vaughn on this season. We have Paulie Calafiore, who I know people don't like, but I still think made for riveting TV, with his downfall in particular being such a great week of the show. We also have the likes of Tiffany Russo. We had the downfall of Frank, which I thought was an interesting storyline. Victor has an interesting arc across this season. Oh, well, again, we get some pretty big gameplay moments. And we get the Jose blindside. We get the Bronte blindside. We have this last-second scramble to try to save Tiffany, only for that to not work. Get the Zakia blindside, the Paulie blindside. We get Victor getting taken out the second time in a spot where they had almost flipped the votes at the very last second. We get the Michelle vote off. We get so many great gameplay moments across this season to where, again, I personally never understood why people don't like this season. I think for me, probably the biggest criticism would be the fact that the season is so long. And it is one of the longer seasons of the show, though I think considering the fact that it is so long, it actually ends up being a mostly consistent ride. So that is why I do have it here in number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a season that used to be higher on my ranking, and straight up, this placement here could definitely be affected by the fact that I haven't watched this season in a while. This is probably one of the seasons that I haven't watched in the longest amount of time at this point. So while I do really like the season, I do feel like a lot of it has kind of become a bit more hazy to me, but it's still a strong season through and through, and that is Big Brother 8. And again, Big Brother 8 is a very strong season. While the gameplay of it might be a bit questionable, it is still a fun ride where, despite America's Player kind of ruining some of the strategy of the game, it's really interesting to see Eric Stein have to deal with this massive anchor on his game, to where mixing down the fact that we have Dick and Danielle's story, to where, again, I don't endorse any of the things Dick does on this season, but I do think they make for pretty riveting TV here in having this estranged father-daughter relationship and them repairing their relationship over the course of the season, even though, again, we know how that turned out now. But I think over the course of this season, it plays into a really solid arc. And again, the season obviously has the constant twists and turns, from Dick and Danielle trying to backdoor Eric, only for that to not work, only for Eric to then be forced to work with Dick anyway. And we get the massive Dustin blindside. We have Jen Johnson on this season, who's incredible TV. We have Dick and Danielle flipping on Jessica at Final 6. And you have this run from Zach at the very end. There's a lot of intrigue on this season, with, again, some pretty wacky characters, though just straight up I don't really have as much of a personal attachment to the season as I do with the next like 3 seasons we'll be talking about, which on most people's lists would probably be lower than BB-8 here. But I do think it's that lack of personal connection that does make me want to put the other ones a bit higher, along with the fact that, again, BB-8, while it is a crazy series of twists and turns, I do also feel like its cast is kind of a bit mixed. Or again, you have the like of like Mike Dutz on this cast, you have Kale, you have Carol, who didn't want to be there. Even Zach isn't the most interesting character in the world. So again, it's definitely a bit of an inconsistent cast in my mind, but still overall a fun season filled with a lot of drama, some really bad gameplay with some interesting gameplay. So that's enough for me to land it here, number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a season that I had actually just rewatched right before making this video, which definitely obviously plays a factor into it being a bit higher on the list, but it's also a season that I just have a lot of nostalgia for, and I do think it's a season with a lot of great characters. And while it's a bit understated in the grand scheme of Big Brother, I do feel like it's still a season that I personally have always loved, and that season is BB5. And again, BB5 is a very nostalgic season to me in this fact that this is actually the first season I have any memory of watching. I mean, while my parents supposedly watched BBs 2, 3, and 4, I have no memory of those seasons. So where BB5 is the first season that I actually have memory of. I remember the Cowboy Nokomis storyline. I remember Jace and his downfall. I remember the twin twists. Like, I remember aspects of this season to where, again, it does add to a bit of nostalgia I have of the season. But even beyond that, it's just actually a fun season through and through. Again, it's a very dynamic season where it's another one of these where it seems like the power structure is constantly flip-flopping after the jury phase of the game, to where it feels like the game's kind of run by these like smaller groupings, especially in the post-jury phase of the game, where we have like Drew and Cowboy navigating together, while also Drew and Diane are a duo. We have Karen and Nokomis. We have Marvin just being this outlier, to which again, Marvin's a great character, even though again, there's some ickiness surrounding him. But again, it's a very dynamic endgame that obviously ends up with Drew cutting Diane, which is this great moment. Diane in particular is a fantastic character as well, along with us getting some great characters early on from the likes of Jace and Scott, with their downfalls being incredible TV. Also the foundation of the back door, and we also have the twin twist, which is still an all-time great segment for me, to where again, like, there's just so much to like from the season from my point of view, to where I can kind of understand why it's a forgotten season, though for me it's always been a season that I've just personally gelled with. And again, part of that has to do with nostalgia, but I still think it's a strong season all the way through. Or even the more mundane weeks, like when the twins get taken out, there's still some intrigue within that. And because of that, for me, it is here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a season that, again, one I have a lot of nostalgia for. This is actually the season that got me back into Big Brother, and that is Big Brother 11. And Big Brother 11, I think it's a season that kind of gets slept on to a degree, like where I personally find it surprising how this isn't universally looked at as a better season than what it is, in the sense that, well, yes, their gameplay of the season is not the most interesting in the world. I mean, no one is playing on a particularly high level across this season. It is still a really fun season where we have the split house right from the beginning. We get a lot of drama from that. We have insane characters from the likes of Russell and Shima and Jesse, Lydia, Kevin, Natalie, Michelle Noonan, obviously Ronnie. Always thought Laura was an interesting player early on. Now, beyond that, obviously there's Jeff and Jordan, who are pretty much the stars of the season, particularly in the fact that they were clearly production favorites. So maybe that can harm your opinion of the season, but I still think they had an interesting arc on this season. And I still think the coup d'etat, while again, a lot of people claim it being rigged from production, like I still think it makes for incredible TV and how it plays out. But again, we also get some like all-time great fights, particularly revolving around Russell. You got Technotronics, we got his fight with Jordan, we get his fight with Ronnie. And the fact that the first round came down to a tie is pretty insane. And again, this really just feels like a good old-fashioned split house that had the two sides pretty much hating each other. That did lead to a lot of interesting TV as well, though, where again, like, I personally love BB11. I can kind of get why people don't, particularly with the coup d'etat kind of halting the season to a degree for a bit, and also the Jordan win probably not being as satisfying for some people. But I still personally love this season. I still think it has a lot of what I'm personally looking for in Big Brother. So for me, it lands here number 7. Now number 6, we're moving on to another season I have a lot of nostalgia for. This being the season that pretty much got me all into Big Brother, as in finally looking at the feeds and the online community, and that season is Big Brother 13. And yeah, BB13, again, was the first point where I decided to finally look at the feeds, where at this point I was a big fan of Brendan and Rachel, and I remember the week where Brendan went home the first time was the first time I ever found myself bothering to look up what's going on the feeds. And again, BB13 is another one of these seasons that I really loved at the time. Now, again, I can understand that people are upset with, again, a lower level of gameplay here. Also, the fact that you could say that the season was rigged for Rachel. But again, I still think most of it made for pretty riveting TV. I mean, well, yeah, I guess the fact that we have vets versus returnees, it's being the closest we get to a full-blown fans versus favorite season is, again, something that doesn't necessarily work out the greatest at all points. I do feel like this actually did turn out pretty fun. Again, we have the vets turning on each other by week 3, and even before that, we have the key blindside, which was an incredible moment of him. I've been trying to stay off the block and then not winning the veto and throwing the veto in order to stay on the block only for him to go home. We also have, again, they're split up in week 3, which is all really fun, only for Danielle to go on this massive underdog run that was fun to see, where we see her and Kalia go back-to-back in HOHs. We also see Lil Juan decide to get himself voted out because he thought he was going to get a superpower, and all that's really fun. The double eviction of this season is still one of my favorite episodes in the history of Big Brother. To see Big Jeff get finally taken out in the way he does. Now, again, the end game, I will say, is a bit slower for sure. I do think once Pandora Box comes into play, it does feel like the intrigue is definitely lessened from that point on, but still, I feel like Rachel has a pretty riveting arc to the end. Again, her winning this season is still an all-time great conclusion to a season, where, again, I personally love this season. I get why people don't like it. And for sure, nostalgia is definitely playing a factor in it being this high, but I still personally find a lot of enjoyment from this season and was very happy with how it played out at the time, where, again, for me, it does land here at number 6. Number 5, and I believe the 5 seasons that are in my top 5 are the exact same as the last time, which is a very minor change, but obviously we'll still run through them anyway. At number 5 is a season that is the most modern season left on the list, and that is BB20. And again, BB20, I think, is obviously the season of 2 halves. The first half is some of the best Big Brother we had ever seen. Again, going from Tyler convincing Kaitlyn at the last second to blindside Steve, to Tyler manipulating Kaitlyn to backdoor Swaggy, to Level 5 flipping the vote onto Winston over Brett, to Kaitlyn and her puzzle in week 4, and then we have the massive Rachel blindside in week 5. That is an absolutely insane 5-week stretch of the show. One of the best 5-week stretches in history of the show. And even then, week 6 has the Bailey-Tyler fight. The following week has Rockstar going out on Haley's HOH, and then we have Fessy nominating Scotty and taking out Scotty when Scotty was one of his few allies. So again, that first 60% or so of the season is very, very strong. But the endgame is obviously a bit of a drag, where outside of the double eviction where Brett goes home, there's really not much intrigue for the rest of the game, where it was pretty clear that Tyler and Casey were going to go to the end, facing almost no real true adversity, and that part of it obviously is a bit lacking, which is why it's at the bottom of this top tier here. But again, the beginning of the season is some of the best Big Brother we had ever seen, and mixing that in the fact that we got some pretty notable characters as well. Again, Tyler's run on this season is still one of the most impressive runs from a non-winner in the history of the show. We have JC, to where, again, questionable person, but definitely really fun TV. We have Brett, who I thought was really great TV. Haley was a rootable underdog. Bailey had some fun moments. Kaitlyn and Swaggy had some really great moments early on. Now, again, I'm personally annoyed by the outcome of the season, where Casey beats Tyler, though in a way I do also feel like it's something that kind of makes the season maybe a little bit better, in the sense that it's not just this kind of boring Tyler steamroll with him ultimately winning. And really, for me, BB20 is the peak of modern Big Brother, to where outside of early on in BB25, I do feel like those early days of BB20 was the most invested I was in watching it live, where, again, I personally just love BB20, even though I understand people's criticisms with it, particularly the ending of the season. But for me, I still have it here at number 5. Now, number 4, moving on to what I believe is the only placement change of the top 5 here, it being a season that I moved down a spot simply because I do feel like as time goes on, I'm probably a little bit lower on the season. That season is Big Brother 7, BB All-Stars, which obviously is still a very good season. I mean, it is an actual successful All-Star season, which was a rarity at this point in reality TV history. We had some incredible storylines coming from this. We had Chilltown really running the majority of the game, which was interesting to see. We had the return of the majority of the Sovereign Six, these rootable underdogs from the previous season, where they end up having interesting runs on their own on this season, particularly obviously Janelle and James. You get to see the return of Daniel Reyes, which was really interesting to see. We get interesting early boot runs from the likes of Allison and Jace. Chicken George was a really interesting character to see on here, and obviously being this massive anomaly, and him essentially playing the game for the first time here, and mixing that in with the fact that we get pretty good gameplay moments, where we really get to see Chilltown really swindling a lot of this cast, then having the great like Howie blindside. We have like Janelle being convinced to put up Marcellus. Week 3 is really great, where Jace ends up getting taken out, and we have the I hate you all speech from Will. We get the end game where Janelle cuts Will, and again, there's just a lot to like there. However, for me, I think the reason why I did drop this on the ranking here is simply because I do feel like the other season that is higher than it probably has a bit more iconic moments for me. It's a season that I do go back to and watch moments from time to time. While I don't really have that with BB7, and also BB7, I do feel like while it is a fun ride, and probably one of the most consistent seasons of the show, I think for me probably lacks like an all-time great moment within it. So again, it's a lot of good moments, but I think it really lacks this like truly elite moment that kind of makes me a bit more reserved in putting it higher on the list. But again, it's still a very good season, one of the most consistent seasons of the show, because that for me, it's here number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to the season that obviously I put above BB7 in that season is BB6. And again, I have a lot of nostalgia for BB6. BB6 is the season that I remember being really invested in when I was a kid. Again, while BB5 was the first season I ever watched, BB6 was the first time I really cared about what was going on. I absolutely adored Kaser at the time and was really interested in his run on the season to obviously devastating degree, but also still really like Janelle and seeing her get all the way to Final 3. I remember just so many moments from this season. The I sealed your partner's fate, the pressure cooker, the actual Kaser blindside the second time around, the devastation at Maggie winning HOH in week 4, just the general split house dynamic that was really fun to see. And Janelle just winning comp after comp in the end game to get her way to 3. You have the bye bye bitches moment. You have Janelle's fight with Bo. Obviously the massive fight in the backyard in week 2, which again, it's a bit icky, but still a massive moment there. Like, to me, like, I just have such an attachment to this season to where, while I do think it's not as consistent of a season as BB7, I think the back half of the season in particular is not as strong as the first half. Outside of Janelle's run in the back half, I do think the back half is kind of slow, with obviously just being split amongst alliance lines, and whoever wins the HOH pretty much determines who goes home. And again, that's not super interesting. Again, there's not much real strategy going on in the back half of the season, but it's still such an iconic season, so many iconic moments, and some iconic characters from the likes of Kaser, Janelle, Howie, James, Yvette, even Jennifer, April, Cappy. It's like, I do feel like there's like so many notable people here, where for me, I land it here at number 3. Now, number 2, we're moving on to a season that, again, is in the same spot as last time, though a season that I still very much enjoy, despite some qualms with it, and that is Big Brother 14. And again, BB14 is obviously a season that largely revolves around Dan, from my point of view. I think a lot of what makes the season as great as it is seeing Dan have to play from the bottom and struggling and overcoming that, and despite those struggles, still making it all the way to Final 2, where I think Dan's BB14 run is probably one of the most entertaining runs of any player on any season of the show. But I do think something that harms BB14 in comparison to the number 1 season is that this is probably less of an ensemble cast in that season, where with this season, again, a lot of it is Dan. I think you also have some intrigue from Ian, Danielle, Frank, Boogie, Brittany. Well, I feel like the cast overall is like kind of just fine. I do feel like there's still a decent amount of people here that don't really do much on the season. Again, you got like Jen, you got like Will, you got Ashley, who does have some dodo moments but doesn't do much. Joe also has some dodo moments, but again, doesn't really do much. Early on, you have someone like a JoJo. Even Janelle has a pretty disappointing run on this season, where again, like I do feel like that is kind of my main issue with this season, is that it is actually a mostly consistent season. I think there's very rarely a slow point in this season. The slowest point is probably week 2 after Willie gets expelled, and beyond that probably like the Will eviction week, but even then there was a consideration of backdooring Dan. But really, I think the post-jury phase of this season is just incredible. It's non-stop action, from this constant targeting of Frank, only for Frank to continuously win comps, to Dan's funeral obviously at the Final 8, which is incredible. You have Dan then presenting to blindside Frank at Final 7, only for him to then try to target Ian, only for Ian to win the veto, and that being a pretty fun double eviction. You at the Final 5, where once again Dan is targeting Shane, only for Shane to win the veto. And then we obviously have the big blindside at Final 4, where Dan snipes Shane out of the game, and we actually get a somewhat interesting Final 3 round for once, of Dan actually convincing the others to throw the HOH, to throw part 1 to him, which is pretty interesting. And again, like, I just feel like Dan and his run in the season is just incredible. incredible. But him just facing adversity constantly and him having to overcome that, which is a large reason why this season is as great as it is, and that's why I have it here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best season of the show has remained the same. It's still Big Brother 10. And again, Big Brother 10, I think, is one of the most consistent seasons on the board. I think it's also a season that has one of the greatest casts in the history of the show, with just so much going for it. Again, you got a decent level of gameplay here from the likes of Dan and Memphis, who really run a lot of the season. You even have like someone like a Keisha, who's a competent player. And even the players aren't necessarily playing well, they're at least playing the game. Again, we instantly see in week 1 this flip against Brian Hart that made for great TV. We again just see the Coven have this bickering between each other, but still working together for a lot of the pre-jury phase of the game. And we have the Jesse blindside, which is probably this big gameplay moment. But again, once again, Dan's run in the season is also still incredible, to where we have him going from the very bottom and him building up social capital to him taking charge of the game. And we have incredible moments like the replacement nominee Roulette. And really, Dan, for me, plays a very fun game to watch on this season. But what makes the season great is it's not just the gameplay. It also has all the drama that you would want. Again, all the fighting between the Coven is incredible TV. I mean, Keisha's birthday obviously is one of the greatest moments in the history of the show, along with the fight that happens after the Jesse eviction. And you get some all-time great characters from the likes of, again, Dan, but also Rennie. You have Jerry, who made for good TV. You have April. You have Libra. You have Jesse. Brian Hart's probably one of the most entertaining first boots in the show, through him having this massive downfall right away. Again, there's just so much to like from BB10. It really gives you everything you would want, from gameplay to drama to characters, while also being a consistently fun ride where there's really not a single completely dud week in the show, with every week bring something of intrigue. So again, I still feel like this is probably the best season of the show. What's funny is that I'm so high on the season, despite the fact that, again, I didn't watch this season live. This is, again, one of the few seasons that I missed at the time. So I think for this to be a season that I missed at the time, and I still have this much adoration for it, really just shows you how highly I do assess it, to where, for me, I do feel like BB10 is by far the best season of the US show, to where for me it is here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my updated season ranking for Big Brother US. Now moving forward, I will be doing my updated winner ranking coming up later this year, and at some point I'll probably end up redoing my North American season winner rankings at some point down the road. I'll probably save that for like next year or something, but I do think at some point I'll end up redoing those as well, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.